Hello and welcome to another virtual program from Maine Historical Society. I'm Kathleen Newman. It's July 15th, 2023, and this is our Historians Forum. Before I turn it over to Ian Saxine, let's just take a moment to remember and to recognize that Maine Historical Society recognizes that what is currently referred to as Maine is Wabanaki homelands, a place the Wabanaki people have stewarded for over 13,000 years. Wherever we are in Maine, we are on Wabanaki homelands. We recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Abenaki, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations within these lands and waters. Understanding Wabanaki history is vital to understanding Maine, and we are committed to helping provide education about this history through partnerships with Wabanaki people. And joining us today to kick off our 2023 Historians Forum is Ian Saxine.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. Welcome to all of you to the 2023 Historians Forum, bringing cutting-edge scholarship to the public in an accessible format. This year's topic is business and economic history in the Pine Tree State since 1973, post-industrialization. I'm joined by three talented scholars with me this morning. The first is Michael Hillard. He's recently retired as professor of economics at the University of Southern Maine. He's published widely in the fields of labor relations, labor and working class history. Among other works, he is the author of Shredding Paper, Labor and the Rise and Fall of Maine's Mighty Paper Industry. He regularly also provides expert testimony on Maine on macroeconomic and employment issues affecting working people. He's currently collaborating with the Maine AFL-CIO in the design and implementation of the newly funded Charles Scontra Center for Labor and Community Education, the University of Southern Maine. Our second guest is Cindy Eisenhower, professor of anthropology and climate change at the University of Maine. Eisenhower currently completed a 5-year National Science Foundation supported project focused on Maine's culture of thrift and its contemporary relevance for economic and climate resilience. Our third speaker today is Stefano Tijerina. He obtained his PhD in history at the University of Maine. He's a lecturer in management at the University of Maine's Business School. He's the inaugural recipient of the Maine Historical Society's P.D. Merrill Research Fellowship, the latest of many awards he has won. One of his most recent book is Opportunism and Goodwill, Canadian Business Expansion in Colombia, 1867 to 1879. And he's authored a number of works on matters economic, all things Western Hemisphere, indeed, and global. So welcome, Michael, Cindy, and Stefano. All right, so the program for today, we're going to have each scholar give a brief talk about their field of research as pertains to Maine's economic history, the theme of this gathering. We'll start with Michael, to be followed by Cindy and then Stefano. And then after these three talks, we will then convene for a general discussion about some of the themes raised by these scholars in their different perspectives and looking at these different aspects of Maine economic history through different lenses. So without further ado, I will pass things over to Michael Hillard.
Well, thank you, Ian, and great to be here with the other panelists today. And let me open up my PowerPoint here and begin my endeavor into talking about the history of the Maine paper industry. Okay, so to begin with, the title of my book and this focus of my talk is Shredding Paper, The Rise and Fall of Maine's Mighty Paper Industry, book that was published a couple years ago by Cornell Press. So the focus of my book is to take a larger story about the economic and labor history of the United States and situate Maine's paper industry. Maine, as I argue in my book, became the Detroit of paper. And my general line is to sort of say that Maine became the Detroit of paper, but few, if any, people really recognize that. So I'm going to talk about, briefly do a sketch of sort of why we became this leading state for the industry in the first 75 years of its existence, taking us into the mid-20th century. And then since 1960, to talk about how structural forces after 1960 created a conflict between the people who owned and managed these firms, which was changing at that time, and the workers who had been here all along, and trace that through the decline of the industry and the resistance of the workers to that. Let's see if I can get this to work here. So I'd like to start with this quote from Maine renowned author Monica Wood, who among her books is a memoir of growing up in Mexico in Rumford, Maine, where one of the major paper mills in the state were, called When We Were the Kennedys. And this sort of eloquent quote captures, I think, the sort of incredible presence that paper mills have been in rural Maine's life. So she says, what is a paper mill? The mill, the rumbling, hard-breathing monster, made steam and noise and grit and stench and dreams and livelihoods, and of course, paper. It possessed a scoured industrial beauty as awesome and ever-changing as the leaf-plumped hills that surrounded us. It made a world unto itself, overbearing and irrefutable. And I just think this statement just captures the breadth and complexity of the presence of mills in rural Maine life, and how much it was a force of both transforming nature and the landscape, but also transforming the lives of people who lived in what were essentially company towns. I always like to start with some pictures of paper mills so you get a sense of how extensive they are, their location on rivers and other things. So this is the first major paper company in Maine, called the S.D. Warren Company, located in Westbrook, Maine. That's 1884. Every paper mill is here in Maine because of the logs, or was here because of the logs. So this is the 21 million log pile at Great Northern Paper in 1908, postcard picture of that. Another pulpwood lot at the Oxford Paper Mill in Rumsford around 1930. And here are a couple paper mills. And so they're kind of like big hulking pieces of metal with most of the action on the inside, so you can't really tell what's going on there. But you know, the location of these being in the most rural parts of the state. Here's the Bucksport Mill in kind of modern times, although it was actually torn down about 2017. That's on the coast of Maine and the Penobscot River. And this is the northernmost mill, the Fraser Paper Mill. That river there separates the US and Canadian border. So you can see those smokestacks on the top are the pulp mills that are actually located in Canada. And then they ship the pulp across the river to the paper mill on the US side. So for my sketch of sort of the rise of industry, I'm going to talk about how the mass production revolution that defined the American economy over 100 years ago came to Maine, on how Maine, and the caveat I always give is that there was one other location where this kind of explosion of paper industrial development happened, and that was Wisconsin. Maine became the Detroit of paper. So the story of why Maine and Maine's participation in the mass production revolution has to do with markets, technology, raw materials, and geography. The US became the largest economy in the world by the late 19th, early 20th century. And you can see it just in the explosion of population from, say, right before Civil War until the time of World War I. That made us 2.5 times the population of England at the time. Per capita annual paper consumption also grows by leaps and bounds, doubling in the period after the Civil War, continuing to double thereafter in the 20th century. We have the issue of literacy, which is the fact that Americans, especially white Americans in the 19th century and Black Americans in the 20th century, were great readers. And so there was a big market for at least those parts of the paper industry that involve reading documents. But actually the key segments expanded quickly because the industry was able to innovate and produce and invent all kinds of other products. So besides newsprint, which was there from the start, they developed advanced printing grades, especially coated publication papers. So you could print color magazines, packaging of all kinds, wrappers, labels, bags, cardboard boxes, home convenience. We all recognize those names, and many other products. And so the total production of paper increased by a factor of 15 in that period from the end of the Civil War to right after World War I, and it became one of the largest industries in the country by the mid-20th century. Technology and raw materials. The key for mass production is to have a machine or a set of machinery that will allow you to mass produce. These were invented by first the Europeans and then adapted here in the United States over the 19th century. And then the shift from rags to trees. Rags was the basic, cloth was the basic input into making paper because you need fiber for long time, centuries really. And then when there was an explosion of the market, we needed much bigger source of raw material, and they moved technologically to using trees. So here's the Ferdrinier, which is a mass production technology that takes a wood pulp that's mostly water, sprays it onto a wire, and then sends it through a series of rolls that squeeze it, dry it, and finish it to make massive rolls of paper. Here's a modern Ferdrinier here in the 21st century, so you can see how big they've gotten. And so, the problem when they were running out of rags in the mid-19th century was to find a new way to use raw material, in this case, trees. They came up with a chemical process using sulfite. And then the march was on to find a place to do this. And of course, Maine happened to be the place on the East Coast that was heavily forested, had the right kind of trees for that technology at the time, which were spruce trees. We had 7 major river systems. Rivers are used to transport trees to mills for power, for steam, for making pulp. So it's essential to production process. And of course, Maine was at the time close to the population centers in the East Coast of the United States. I like this map because the green in these two maps show on the left where the private forest ownership was. The paper companies used to own roughly half the state. And then on the right is the dark greens are where people are not. So it's unpopulated forestry territory. And then you can see all the river systems in Maine. And so around the end of the 19th century, investors were willing to come and invest tons of money, millions of dollars at the time, which was quite a bit, to build from scratch these mills in the deep rural parts of the state. So in the 1890s, the core mills of International Paper were built. Great Northern Paper and Oxford Paper, two of the leading companies, were built starting in 1901. There's the production process of, or the construction process of building the mills in Oxford, in Rumford, Maine, the Oxford Paper Mill around the turn of the century, a century ago. Westbrook's S.D. Warren Company was founded earlier, but it grew rapidly only in the late 19th century, and you can see some other major companies that were built there. And so what were the nature of these companies? Well, they tend to have corporate offices in nearby major cities, and I list some obvious ones there, especially Boston, Stamford, and New York City. The company leaders and the sales force that were located at these corporate offices visited the mills routinely, so there was an integration between the top office and the mills. The mill managers tended to come up through the ranks and then actually manage the mills for 10 to 20 years and sometimes longer. So there was a close sense of relationship and cohesion between the workers and the managers. I just always like to note that these were high-tech enterprises from the beginning because they were based on chemistry. They made investments in R&D and marketing, and they branched out from the initial base of product lines to produce a wide array of products. The SD Warren Mill in the mid-20th century, in a given week, might make run 30 different products on their 14 machines. The industry was evolving in the 20th century as new technology using sulfate chemistry was able to use the fast-growing trees of the South. So northern companies would take advantage of this new cheap raw material to build mills in the South. And this I'll talk more about in a minute. These sort of locally, regionally managed companies by the 50s and 60s were starting to sell out to national paper conglomerates, which had big implications for the industry and for the communities and workers. Just to say a little bit about paper mill employment, maybe we can come back to this in the discussion. Paper mills were brutal places to work in many ways, but they were also highly skilled places. Because they were so capital intensive, the goal of management was to have workers work all the time because it was costly to shut down the mill even for a day. And as Barry Kenny of Westbrook, Maine once said, the environment could be summed up in one word: harsh. The workers did shift work. It's a description of the shift structure that they had, but they were going from daytime to evening to the graveyard shift every month, and they tended to work as many as 39 or 40 Sundays a year. People got affected by limbs, hearing loss, lung disease, cancer, and grisly deaths. I'd like to commend Carrie Arsenal's recent book, Milltown, for depicting the cancer clusters that emerged in towns like Rumford, Maine. But the skill and craft pride was at the center of the work that they did, because the mill couldn't just sort of set up an assembly line. They really had to rely on the skills of workers, and the workers had to be very much dedicated to the success of the firm for the paper to come out as quality paper. At the heart of these mills, with 5 generations of the same management and ownership, was a relatively generous paternalism that was based in part on the fact that the companies were very profitable, but also because you could count on them for being, a place where a sense of commitment to the firm was central to its success. So they paid higher wages than any other blue-collar work in the state. They had family hiring systems that went on for generations. There was a lauding of founding fathers, which I'll touch on briefly at the end of the talk. And the companies were basically comfortable with acquiescing to unionization, with the exception of the SD Warren Mill, which resisted it in the 1940s, a big national upsurge in unionization, in part because they brought in unions that were less challenging to the companies than some of the other unions that existed at the time. By the 1970s, every major mill in Maine was being absorbed into a national and international conglomerate. And I just list a number of the mill towns in Maine, from Westbrook to Baileyville to Madawaska and everything in between, where this happened. And they were coming under the control now of a new wave of CEOs, which had to respond to Wall Street's dictates. And I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute, that companies raise their profit margins, or will install a CEO that will engage in painful financial engineering. At the same time, for the first time, except for a brief burst around 1910, there was an uprising rebellion on the part of the workers. Virtually every Maine mill in the state experienced a strike in the 60s and 70s. This was precipitated by now being managed by outsiders, in their perception, and also by a spirit of rebellion in that era. Anybody who knows anything about the 60s knows about civil rights and the anti-war movement. This was affecting blue-collar workers in Maine as well. My book tells 3 case studies there of these rebellions. One was the fall of Mother Warren to unionization. The second was a really remarkable strike that took place in Madawaska in 1971, and then finally a sort of exotic strike in the Maine woods in 1975. And I'm not going to describe them in detail, but the first 2 are available to you online as podcasts that I produced from my 160 oral history interviews, and I would commend you for that, for the texture and drama of those struggles and the backstories of those companies as well. So what happened as new managers came in is that they were running roughshod over workers. They were betraying earlier promises or understandings that existed between management and workers. They were violating their moral sensibilities. And these communities had developed a strong and powerful ethical sense about their work and about their connection to the mill. That word should not be fun. So let me just restate what's there at the bottom. The paper mills, in the eyes of the workers and really the managers as well, were being run as community institutions with all participants, not just the managers, not just the owners, certainly not just as shareholders, as stakeholders in the success of the enterprise. By the 1980s, there were especially strong, but some of this came before, hardball demands to change work practices, which ran into conflict with the existing union contracts that had been fought for over the years, to accept the loss of jobs and maintenance, which is a big part of the mill, and some of the best paid jobs, and overall cuts of wages and benefits. What this was being sparked by, and I'm going to talk about this briefly in the last part of my talk and maybe more later, was that there's a transformation in the American economy where Wall Street had not really shaped manufacturing until the 1980s, but then powerful institutional investors and new sensibilities, many of which you're aware of, imprinted this sort of new movement to just really raise the amount of profit that companies built, and if it meant destroying the companies in the meantime, that was considered just good capitalism. And it got kicked off by Milton Friedman saying in 1970 that the only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. And the way I always like to sort of summarize, well, what did this sort of financialization of the economy mean? It meant that Wall Street owners of companies were looking at corporations that paid workers well as stealing profits from the shareholders, and that there were ways of getting out of well-paid work and getting into poor paid work. So raise your profit margins or we'll fire your CEO and place with someone else. In the 1980s, this led to a couple of different ways in which companies squeezed the workers to try and raise their profits. The most notable low-road examples were Boise and Jay, where the companies intentionally planned to provoke strikes to fire their workers and replace the unionized workers with non-union workers. And this succeeded especially well in Jay. This changed paper mill life forever in Maine, and still most of the employment that existed at the industry's peak was still around at that point. There was a statewide movement during the Jay strike against these betrayals, and the development of what I call a folk political economy, in which workers were taking their collective memories of the past and seeing a contrast between an older stakeholder capitalism, where the institution was valued as an entity of itself, and the role of the workers in it is seen as crucial, to a new low-road approach that was very much the opposite. The most extreme version of financialization happened with Scott Paper, where there was 3 mills in Maine that I list there, that they literally did bring in a new CEO after firing an older one who wasn't doing a good enough job raising profits in 1994 to financially engineer the company. And basically they broke it up. Chainsaw Al cut, basically about 35–40% of the jobs out, and raised $6 billion in windfall profits for for shareholders, without doing anything positive for the companies themselves. And in fact, many of their best mills were closed in their wake. I have these quotes here, which I'm just going to show you them and summarize them. But here's David Martin, who worked in the Westbrook Mill in late 1900s. And I talked to him in his retirement in 2003. And what he says in this quote, which is in my book, and it's also in the podcast on SD Warren, talks about how when the companies merged, the managers from away were taking away their product lines and sending them to other places that didn't know how to make the kind of paper that was made in Westbrook, that ran these brands into the ground. Those brands went out of business. They never brought the paper back to where it could be made properly. And in the end, they basically were debasing the industry, hauling it out from the inside and accelerating its demise. And then this is a quote that talks about Chris Murray, a young skilled trades worker, just left Westbrook in 2000, talking about his memories of the founder, S.D. Warren, who gave generously to the community out of the profits of the company, that sort of stakeholder capitalism, and sort of saying, you know, if this man were alive today, he'd be rolling over his grave in the destruction that was happening under Chainsaw Al. So lessons for the 21st century is that many people in America, and I've encountered this in doing my scholarship and teaching over the years, really think that the decline of rural blue-collar manufacturing in the country is mainly globalization. It's China in some sort of sense. It may be automation. We're hearing more about that now with AI and so forth. But I want to argue that financialization is really, if not certainly a major driving force in the decline. And I would say the gratuitous decline of Maine in U.S. industry. And much of the decline that happened in the Maine paper industry and the drama I described in my book happened before China entered the WTO in 2001 and became a major competitor in products like paper. And of course, what China has done that the United States has not done is to pour federal money into research that makes them a more competitive industry than the U.S. domestic industry. So finally, to get to the workers, I think what happened over the last 20 years is a recognition in blue-collar America that the policy agenda shared by Democrats and Republicans like NAFTA, WTO, free trade, didn't do anything for these workers in rural areas, that their industries were on the ropes. They were being outcompeted by other companies that were in other nations that supported their industries in ways America did not. And so I think the question that we should put forward from this lesson is, what kind of corporate capitalism will we have in the future here in Maine and the United States? And I'll just say briefly, if I can get this slide up, that the issue of financialization is the one that is still with us, that it's transformed the entire economy, and some of the most recent developments that have really negatively impacted America in visible ways. The almost strike last fall over overwork in the railroads, and then the East Palestine toxic railway disaster. The Southwest Airlines snafu at Christmas last year, what's going on in nursing homes, that the public is being impacted, not just employees, but the public is being impacted by the gratuitous distribution of massive amounts of profit to investors. And I list some of the amounts there. And what we should be thinking about for the future, I think, is a different mode of ownership where stakeholderism can make a return. And I will stop there.